November 14, 1976. The outskirts of Los Angeles, California. A construction crew was excavating a lot in the San Fernando Valley for what would become another strip mall in the endless sprawl of Southern California. The morning was cool, the sky a pale gray that seemed to press down upon the earth like a weight. Workers moved through the dirt with backhoes and shovels, their breath visible in the early chill, their conversations punctuated by the rhythmic clang of metal against stone. At approximately 9:47 de la mañana, a machine operator named Carlos Mendez felt his excavator strike. Something solid beneath the surface. Something that was not rock. Not concrete. Not the usual debris of forgotten construction projects. He stopped the machine, climbed down, and began to dig with his hands. What he found would connect to a world of celebrity, power, and violence that most Americans only glimpsed through tabloid headlines. The first thing Mendez saw was a strip of what appeared to be dark wool. Rotted, but still recognizable as something that had once been expensive. He called over his supervisor, a heavyset man named Frank Torres, who had worked construction in the valley for 30 years. Torres knelt beside the shallow excavation and brushed away more dirt with gloved hands. The fabric was attached to something larger. Something that yielded to his touch with a sickening softness. He pulled back his hand, as if he had touched a live wire. In that moment, the ordinary Tuesday morning transformed into something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Torres stood up slowly, his face the color of chalk, and told Mendez to call the police immediately. Within 40 minutes, the construction site had been transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off an area the size of a basketball court. Los Angeles Police Department cruisers lined the road leading to the lot, their lights flashing in rhythmic patterns that drew the attention of curious neighbors. Detective Robert Halloran, of the LAPD Homicide Division, arrived at 10:32 de la mañana. His gray trench coat flapping in the wind that had begun to sweep across the valley. He was a veteran of 23 years on the force, a man who had seen more bodies than he cared to remember. But something about this scene made him pause. The location, the depth of burial, the quality of the clothing, all of it, suggested a level of planning and resources that elevated this beyond a typical homicide. The excavation proceeded with painstaking care. Forensic technicians worked with brushes and small trowels, treating the site like an archaeological dig rather than a crime scene. By noon, they had uncovered the full outline of a human form, curled in a fetal position as if seeking warmth in the cold earth. The body was male, that much was clear, and the clothing, despite years of decomposition, spoke of wealth. A silk tie, now faded to a brownish gray. Italian leather shoes, the soles barely worn. A gold watch on the left wrist, its crystal cracked, but the brand still visible, Rolex. Detective Halloran stood at the edge of the grave and lit a cigarette, his mind already racing through the possibilities. This was no vagrant, no anonymous victim of random violence. This was someone who had mattered to someone. The medical examiner arrived shortly after 1 o'clock, a wiry woman named Dr. Patricia Keene, who had been extracting secrets from corpses for nearly 2 decades. She descended into the shallow grave with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago made peace with death. Her preliminary examination revealed several critical details. The victim was male, likely in his early 40s at the time of death. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force, trauma to the skull. Multiple impacts that had shattered the occipital bone and driven fragments into the brain tissue. But what caught Dr. Keene's attention was what she found in the victim's jacket pocket, a leather wallet, remarkably preserved by the alkaline soil, containing a California driver's license and several business cards. The name on the license was Andrew Joseph Celentano. The address was in Beverly Hills. Detective Halloran took the wallet in gloved hands and studied the driver's license photograph. The face that stared back at him was handsome in a rough-hewn way, a broad forehead, deep-set eyes, a nose that had clearly been broken at least once. The expiration date on the license was March 1971, which suggested the victim had been in the ground for at least 5 years, possibly longer. Hayoran flipped through the business cards and felt his stomach tighten. One of the cards bore the name of a talent agency in Hollywood. Another listed a security consulting firm. But the third card, worn and creased as if it had been handled many times, was printed with a name that every American would recognize: Frank Sinatra Enterprises. Beneath the name was a handwritten phone number and 2 words: call anytime. The discovery of Andrew Celentano's body set in motion an investigation that would ultimately touch the highest levels of American entertainment and the darkest corners of organized crime. Hayoran, standing in that windswept lot as the afternoon shadows lengthened, could not have known the full scope of what he was about to uncover. But he knew enough to understand that this was not going to be a simple case. The connection to Frank Sinatra, America's most beloved singer, the chairman of the board, the man whose voice had soundtracked a generation, meant that every step of the investigation would be scrutinized, questioned, and potentially obstructed. He looked down at the grave, at the sad remains of a man who had once walked in rarefied circles, and made a silent promise to find out what had happened. By evening, the news had begun to leak. Local television stations interrupted their programming to report that a body had been found in the San Fernando Valley, possibly connected to organized crime. The name Andrew Celentano meant nothing to most viewers, but the rumors of a connection to Frank Sinatra spread through Hollywood like wildfire. Journalists began making calls, digging through archives, trying to piece together the story of a man who had apparently vanished without anyone noticing or caring. What they would find was a tale of loyalty and betrayal, of glamour and violence, of a world where the beautiful people danced with devils and sometimes paid the ultimate price. The valley had seen its share of buried secrets. This land, once covered with orange groves and cattle ranches, had been transformed over the decades into an endless grid of subdivisions and shopping centers. Beneath its sun-baked surface lay the detritus of 100 years of development, broken pipes, forgotten foundations, the occasional time capsule left by optimistic schoolchildren. But it also held darker remnants. The mob had used the valley as a dumping ground since the 1942, when Mickey Cohen's crew controlled the rackets from Santa Monica to San Bernardino. Bodies had been found before, would be found again, but few carried the explosive potential of Andrew Celentano's remains. The lot where the body was discovered had changed hands multiple times over the years. In 1971, it had been part of a larger parcel owned by a real estate investment company with ties to Las Vegas. The company had planned to build an apartment complex, but the project had stalled due to financing problems and had never broken ground. For 5 years, the lot had sat empty, overgrown with weeds, occasionally used by teenagers for parties and by homeless transients seeking shelter. No one had thought to dig beneath the surface. No one had suspected that the unremarkable piece of land concealed a murder victim whose death would eventually implicate some of the most powerful men in America. Detective Hayoran spent the evening of November 7th reviewing missing persons reports from 1970 and 1971. Andrew Celentano's name appeared nowhere in the files. No one had reported him missing. No one had expressed concern about his whereabouts. This alone was significant. A man does not simply vanish without someone noticing, unless that someone has reason to remain silent. Hayoran made a list of questions that needed answers. Who was Andrew Celentano? What was his connection to Frank Sinatra? Why had no one reported him missing? And most importantly, who had killed him and buried him in an empty lot in the San Fernando Valley? The answers, Hayoran would soon discover, led back to a world of smoke-filled nightclubs and ringside tables, of private jets and palatial estates, of whispered conversations and unspoken agreements. It was a world where a handshake could seal $1 million deal or a death sentence, where loyalty was the highest virtue and betrayal the unforgivable sin. Andrew Celentano had lived in that world, had thrived in it for years, until something had gone terribly wrong. The story of his rise and fall would illuminate the dark heart of American celebrity culture and the price some men paid for getting too close to the sun. The forensic examination of Celentano's remains continued over the following days, revealing additional details about his final hours. The multiple skull fractures suggested he had been beaten with a heavy object, likely a baseball bat or a metal pipe, before being buried. There were no defensive wounds on his arms or hands, which indicated he had been restrained or taken by surprise. Soil analysis suggested the burial had occurred in late spring or early summer, probably May or June of 1971. The timing was significant. May 1971 was the same month that Andrew Celentano had reportedly left Frank Sinatra's employment under circumstances that remain murky. The investigation into Celentano's past revealed a man who had risen from humble origins to move among the elite. Born in Newark, New Jersey, in 1929, he had grown up in the same Italian-American neighborhoods that had produced Sinatra himself. The two men had known each other since childhood, had attended the same Catholic school, had run the same streets during the lean years of the Depression. When Sinatra's career took off in the 1942, Celentano had followed him to Hollywood, working first as a driver, then as a personal assistant, and finally as a bodyguard and confidant. For nearly 3 decades, he had been a fixture in Sinatra's inner circle, a trusted presence at recording sessions and film sets, at parties in Palm Springs, and shows in Las Vegas. But by the late 1962, the relationship between the two men had begun to sour. Celentano had developed a reputation for talking too freely, for dropping hints about Sinatra's private life to journalists and hangers-on. He had also begun to drink heavily, a liability for a man whose job required constant vigilance and discretion. In the spring of 1971, according to multiple sources, Sinatra had fired Celentano after a heated argument at the singer's compound in Rancho Mirage. The official reason given was personal differences, but rumors circulated that Celentano had threatened to write a tell-all book about his years with Sinatra, a book that would expose the singer's connections to organized crime and his involvement in activities that could end his career. The prospect of such a book would have sent shockwaves through multiple worlds. Frank Sinatra's relationships with organized crime figures were an open secret in Hollywood, but they had never been documented in detail by someone with first-hand knowledge. A book by Andrew Celentano could have named names, described meetings, provided evidence of transactions that powerful men had worked hard to keep hidden. It could have implicated not only Sinatra but also the mob bosses who had helped build his career and protected his interests for decades. For men accustomed to solving problems through intimidation and violence, the threat of such exposure would have demanded a decisive response. The historical context of Sinatra's mob connections stretched back to the very beginning of his career. His family had come from Lercara Fritti, Sicily, the same small town that had produced Lucky Luciano, the architect of the modern American mafia. Growing up in Hoboken, New Jersey, Sinatra had been surrounded by men connected to organized crime. His parents ran a tavern during Prohibition, which required them to obtain liquor from bootleggers and protection from local gangsters. These early relationships would shape Sinatra's entire career, providing him with connections and resources that legitimate channels could never have offered. The FBI had maintained a file on Frank Sinatra since the 1942, documenting his associations with known organized crime figures and his involvement in various suspicious activities. The file eventually grew to more than 400 pages, containing surveillance reports, wiretap transcripts, and intelligence assessments that painted a portrait of a man deeply enmeshed in the underworld. Special agents tracked Sinatra's movements through casinos and nightclubs, recorded his conversations with mob bosses, and compiled dossiers on everyone in his inner circle. Andrew Celentano's name appeared in these files numerous times, always described as a trusted Sinatra associate with his own connections to organized crime figures in both New Jersey and California. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in the spring of 1971 involves Frank Sinatra's inner circle, the Chicago outfit, the Los Angeles crime family, and a man who knew too many secrets. The questions investigators faced were both fascinating and terrifying. By the end of this story, you will understand how a bodyguard who had protected the chairman of the board for 3 decades ended up buried in a shallow grave, and why his death remained hidden for more than 5 years. The answers reveal a side of American entertainment history that most people never see. Andrew Joseph Celentano was 42 years old in the spring of 1971. A stocky man who stood 5 feet 10 inches and weighed approximately 215 pounds. His hair was jet black, slicked back with pomade in the style he had favored since his youth. His eyes were brown, deep-set beneath heavy brows that gave him a perpetually serious expression. Those who knew him described him as loyal to a fault, a man who took his responsibilities seriously and expected the same from others. He favored dark suits, white shirts, and narrow ties, the uniform of his profession. On his left wrist, he wore the Rolex Oyster Perpetual that Sinatra had given him for his 40th birthday, a gift that would eventually help identify his remains. The Celentano family had emigrated from Sicily in the early 1902, settling in the Italian enclave of Newark's First Ward. Andrew's father, Giuseppe, worked as a longshoreman on the docks of Port Newark, unloading ships that arrived from Europe and South America. His mother, Maria, took in laundry and sewing to supplement the family income. They lived in a cramped apartment above a bakery on 7th Avenue, sharing 2 bedrooms with Andrew and his 3 siblings. It was a hard life, made harder by the Depression, but the Celentanos prided themselves on their resilience and their devotion to family. These values would shape Andrew's character and ultimately lead to his destruction. Growing up in Newark's First Ward, Andrew Celentano learned early that survival required toughness and cunning. The neighborhood was controlled by various factions of the Italian-American underworld, and young men were often recruited to run numbers, deliver packages, or serve as lookouts for illegal gambling operations. Andrew avoided the worst of these entanglements, but he developed a familiarity with the mob that would prove useful in later years. He also developed a talent for boxing, training at a local gym where he earned a reputation as a fearsome puncher with an iron chin. His boxing career was cut short by World War II, but the skills he learned in the ring served him well as a bodyguard. It was during the war years that Andrew Celentano first connected with Frank Sinatra in a professional capacity. Sinatra, rejected for military service due to a perforated eardrum, was building his career as a singer and actor while other young men fought overseas. He needed people around him who could handle the increasingly chaotic crowds of screaming fans. And Celentano, too old for the draft and looking for steady work, fit the bill perfectly. Their shared Newark background created an instant bond, and Celentano quickly became part of Sinatra's inner circle. He was there for the Bobby Soxer riots of 1944, for the tumultuous years at Columbia Records, for the career slump and spectacular comeback that defined Sinatra's professional life. By the 1952, Andrew Celentano had become indispensable to Sinatra's operation. He served not only as a bodyguard, but as a fixer, handling the delicate situations that arose when a man of Sinatra's appetites and temper moved through the world. He paid off angry husbands, smoothed over disputes with club owners, and occasionally delivered messages to individuals who needed persuading. He also served as a liaison between Sinatra and the organized crime figures who had helped launch the singer's career. Men like Sam Giancana of the Chicago outfit, Carlo Gambino of the New York families, and Jack Dragna of the Los Angeles mob all knew Celentano by name and trusted him to keep their business with Sinatra confidential. The relationship between Sinatra and the mob was symbiotic and complex. The mob provided Sinatra with connections, protection, and access to venues that might otherwise have been closed to him. In return, Sinatra provided the mob with respectability, celebrity, and a legitimate front for various enterprises. Celentano moved between these worlds with ease, attending meetings in Las Vegas, hotel suites, and parties at mob-controlled nightclubs. He knew where the bodies were buried both literally and figuratively, and this knowledge made him both valuable and dangerous. As long as he remained loyal, he was protected. The moment his loyalty came into question, he became a liability. Andrew Celentano's personal life was modest compared to his famous employers. He never married, though he maintained a long-term relationship with a woman named Catherine Rossi, a seamstress who worked in Hollywood's costume departments. They lived together in a small house in Burbank, a comfortable but unpretentious dwelling that reflected Celentano's working-class values. He sent money regularly to his mother in Newark and made annual trips back east to visit family and old friends. These trips often coincided with Sinatra's engagements at East Coast venues, allowing Celentano to combine business with personal obligations. The car that Celentano drove was perhaps his one indulgence, a 1968 Cadillac El Dorado, in midnight blue, the kind of car that announced its driver as a man of substance. He kept it meticulously maintained, washing it every weekend and taking it to the same mechanic in North Hollywood for regular service. The car was later found abandoned in a parking lot near Los Angeles International Airport, its keys still in the ignition, its interior showing no signs of struggle. This discovery, made 3 weeks after Celentano's disappearance, was the first indication that something had gone wrong. But by then, no one was looking very hard. Celentano's daily routine during his years with Sinatra had been one of constant vigilance and flexibility. He rose early, often before dawn, to prepare for whatever the day might bring. He accompanied Sinatra to recording sessions that could last 12 hours, to film sets that demanded his presence from morning until night, to parties that began at midnight and ended with the sunrise. He was always armed, always watching, always ready to intervene if a situation threatened to spiral out of control. This discipline had served him well for 3 decades, but it had also taken a toll. The drinking that eventually cost him his position had begun, according to friends, as a way to cope with the relentless pressure of his job. The last confirmed sighting of Andrew Celentano alive occurred on May 23, 1971, at a coffee shop in Palm Springs. A waitress named Linda Martinez remembered him because he had left a generous tip and had seemed preoccupied, checking his watch repeatedly and glancing toward the door. He had ordered black coffee and a ham sandwich, eaten quickly, and departed in his blue Cadillac. Martinez noticed that he turned left out of the parking lot, heading toward the desert rather than back toward Los Angeles. She thought nothing of it at the time. 2 weeks later, when his car was found at Lax, she would remember the encounter and wonder where he had been going that morning. The hours between Andrew Celentano's breakfast in Palm Springs and his apparent departure from Los Angeles remain a mystery. There are theories, supported by circumstantial evidence and the later testimony of mob informants, but no definitive account of his final day. What seems certain is that he met with someone, or several someones during those hours, and that the meeting did not go as he had hoped. The beating that killed him was brutal and prolonged, the work of professionals who knew how to inflict maximum damage. He was almost certainly dead before he was placed in the trunk of a car and driven to the empty lot in the San Fernando Valley. The world that Andrew Celentano inhabited during his 3 decades with Frank Sinatra was a world of contradictions. On the surface, it was glamorous: the parties, the women, the famous faces that moved through Sinatra's orbit like planets around the sun. But beneath the surface, it was ruthless, governed by codes of honor that masked a fundamental immorality. Celentano had navigated this world successfully for years, but his attempt to profit from his knowledge, if indeed that was his intention, had been a fatal miscalculation. The men who controlled that world did not tolerate loose ends, and Andrew Celentano, with his stories and his grievances, had become a loose end that needed to be tied off. Sam Giancana, the Chicago boss who stood at the center of Sinatra's underworld connections, was a man of legendary brutality and cunning. Born Salvatore Giancana in 1908 on the west side of Chicago, he had risen through the ranks of the Quarantidos gang, a notoriously violent youth crew, to become the operational boss of the Chicago outfit by the late 1952. His territory extended from the gambling dens of Cicero to the casinos of Las Vegas, from the nightclubs of Rush Street to the hotels of Havana. He was a man who had ordered dozens of murders, who had collaborated with the CIA on plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, and who had shared a mistress with President John F. Kennedy. When Frank Sinatra needed something done, Sam Giancana was often the man who made it happen. The relationship between Sinatra and Giancana had been cemented in the late 1952, when Sinatra purchased an interest in the Cal Neva Lodge and Casino on the shores of Lake Tahoe. Giancana, according to FBI surveillance and later testimony, held a hidden interest in the property, using Sinatra as a frontman. The arrangement worked well until the summer of 1963, when Giancana was spotted at the Cal Neva, despite being on Nevada's list of excluded persons. The resulting scandal cost Sinatra his gaming license and strained his relationship with the Nevada Gaming Commission for years. But it did not end his relationship with Giancana, which continued until the mob boss's murder in 1975. The night of December 8, 1963, brought another crisis that would test Sinatra's connections to the underworld. That evening, 19-year-old Frank Sinatra Jr. was kidnapped at gunpoint from his hotel room at Harrah's Club in Lake Tahoe, where he was performing with the Tommy Dorsey Band. The kidnappers, a group of amateur criminals led by a pill-addicted young man named Barry Keenan, demanded a $240 ransom from the senior Sinatra. While the FBI worked the case through official channels, Sinatra secretly reached out to his mob contacts, asking them to use their networks to find his son. According to later accounts, 9 people died as Giancana's men pursued leads and interrogated potential informants, none of whom, it turned out, had any connection to the kidnapping. When Andrew Celentano was fired by Frank Sinatra in the spring of 1971, the news traveled quickly through Hollywood's back channels. Within hours, every mob-connected figure in Los Angeles knew that the singer had cut ties with his longtime bodyguard. The official story was that Celentano had become unreliable, that his drinking had affected his performance, that it was simply time for a change. But those who knew the real dynamics understood that something more significant had occurred. Celentano had crossed a line, had made threats that could not be ignored, and had sealed his own fate in the process. The immediate response to Celentano's dismissal came not from Sinatra himself, but from his closest associate, Ermenegildo Rizzo, known to everyone as Gilly. Rizzo ran a famous saloon in New York, and had become Sinatra's most trusted companion, handling matters that required discretion and, occasionally, force. According to later testimony by mob turncoat Jimmy Fratieno, Rizzo approached him in June 1971 with a request from Sinatra. The request was simple and chilling. Celentano needed to be taught a lesson. He needed to understand that certain lines could not be crossed. Fratieno, the acting boss of the Los Angeles crime family, agreed to handle the matter. The investigation into Celentano's disappearance, such as it was, lasted less than 2 weeks. Lap detectives made routine inquiries, interviewed a few of Celentano's associates, and concluded that he had likely left town of his own volition. The discovery of his car at LAX supported this theory. No one filed a missing persons report. No one demanded answers. Catherine Rossi, his longtime girlfriend, received a visit from 2 men who suggested strongly that she should not make trouble. She packed her belongings and moved back to her family in New York, never speaking publicly about her relationship with Celentano or the circumstances of his disappearance. The FBI was aware of the situation but chose not to pursue it aggressively. Agents assigned to monitor organized crime in Los Angeles noted Celentano's disappearance in their reports and speculated about possible mob involvement. But they lacked the evidence to open a formal investigation. Frank Sinatra's name appeared in the margins of these reports, as it had for decades, but no direct connection could be established. The Bureau had bigger fish to fry: the ongoing war against the 5 families in New York. the infiltration of the Teamsters Union, the casino skimming operations in Las Vegas, one missing bodyguard in Los Angeles, barely registered on their radar. The years passed, and Andrew Celentano faded from memory. The lot where his body lay hidden was sold and resold, its ownership passing through a series of shell companies before ending up with the developer who would finally break ground in November 1976. Frank Sinatra continued his career, releasing albums, performing in Las Vegas, navigating the changing landscape of American entertainment. His mob connections remained an open secret, occasionally surfacing in news reports and congressional hearings, but never seriously threatening his status as a cultural icon. The men who might have known what happened to Celentano kept their silence, bound by codes of omerta that had governed their world for generations. The 1972 brought turbulent changes to both the entertainment industry and organized crime. The Watergate scandal exposed corruption at the highest levels of government, making Americans more skeptical of their institutions than ever before. The FBI, freed from the dominating influence of J. Edgar Hoover, who died in 1972, began pursuing organized crime with renewed vigor. Congressional committees held hearings that exposed mob influence in unions, casinos, and legitimate businesses. The old alliances that had protected men like Frank Sinatra began to fray as former associates turned informant, and formerly secret documents were made public. Gili Risso, the man who had allegedly conveyed Sinatra's wishes regarding Celentano to Jimmy Fratianno, remained at the singer's side throughout these turbulent years. He served as gatekeeper, confidant, and enforcer, protecting Sinatra from the consequences of his own temper and poor judgment. Risso would remain loyal until his death in 1992, killed in a car accident on his 75th birthday, when a drunk driver struck his vehicle in Rancho Mirage, California. Frank Sinatra was devastated by the loss, reportedly leaving $100,000 to Risso in his will, a bequest that was never paid because Risso had predeceased him. The mob itself underwent significant changes during these years. Sam Giancana, the Chicago boss who had been close to both Sinatra and the Kennedy family, was murdered in his Oak Park home in June 1975, shot 7 times with a .22 caliber pistol while cooking sausage and peppers in his basement kitchen. The killing, never officially solved, was widely attributed to fellow mobsters who feared what Giancana might reveal to a Senate committee investigating CIA mafia collaboration on assassination plots against Fidel Castro. His death eliminated one of the few people who might have been able to illuminate the full extent of Sinatra's underworld connections. Jimmy Fratianno, the Los Angeles mob boss who had allegedly arranged for Celentano's beating, survived the turbulent 1972 by doing something that violated every principle of his criminal code. He became a government witness, facing murder charges and convinced that his own organization had marked him for death. Fratianno agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in 1977. His testimony would eventually help convict dozens of mob figures and expose the inner workings of La Cosa Nostra to public scrutiny. Among the many revelations in his debriefings was a cryptic reference to a problem that had been handled for Frank Sinatra in 1971. The discovery of Celentano's body in November 1976 forced the FBI to take a fresh look at the case. Agents reviewed their old files, interviewed potential witnesses, and attempted to reconstruct the events leading up to the murder. They quickly identified Celentano as a former Sinatra associate who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. They also identified several possible suspects, including members of the Los Angeles crime family who had been active in 1971. But the passage of time had eroded much of the evidence. Witnesses had died, moved away, or developed convenient lapses in memory. The investigation proceeded slowly. Hampered by bureaucratic obstacles and the reluctance of key figures to cooperate, Frank Sinatra himself was never formally interviewed in connection with the Celentano murder. His lawyers made clear that any attempt to question the singer would be met with fierce legal resistance, and prosecutors concluded that they lacked sufficient evidence to compel his testimony. Sinatra issued no public statement about the case, maintaining the same silence that had served him well throughout his career. His associates followed suit, presenting a unified wall of denial and deflection that frustrated investigators and journalists alike. The message was clear: whatever had happened to Andrew Celentano, Frank Sinatra was not going to discuss it. The investigation into Celentano's death continued sporadically through the late 1972 and into the 1982, generating occasional headlines but never resulting in charges. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office reviewed the evidence multiple times and concluded each time that the case was essentially unprosecutable. Key witnesses refused to testify. Physical evidence had degraded. The passage of time had made it impossible to establish a clear chain of events or to identify the specific individuals responsible for the murder. The case remained officially open but practically dormant, another unsolved killing in a city that had seen thousands. The broader world of organized crime that had produced and protected men like Andrew Celentano was itself in decline. The RICO Act, passed in 1970, had given federal prosecutors powerful new tools to attack mob organizations, and they used these tools aggressively throughout the 1982. Family bosses who had operated with impunity for decades found themselves facing long prison sentences. Soldiers who had never contemplated betraying their oaths chose cooperation over incarceration. The old ways, the codes of silence, the hierarchies of respect, the elaborate rituals of induction began to crumble under the pressure of relentless prosecution. Frank Sinatra witnessed these changes from a position of increasing distance. His mob friends died or went to prison, their empires dismantled by federal authorities. His own activities came under renewed scrutiny as investigators pursued leads generated by cooperating witnesses. In 1981, he appeared before the Nevada Gaming Commission to defend his application for a gaming license, facing questions about his mob associations that he dismissed as old rumors and unfounded speculation. He received the license, but the hearing exposed the limits of his ability to control the narrative about his past. The world was changing, and even the chairman of the board could not stop it. The final years of Frank Sinatra's life were marked by declining health and increasing isolation. He performed less frequently, his legendary voice diminished by age and illness. Old friends died one by one. Dean Martin, in 1995, Sammy Davis Jr. In 1990, countless others who had populated the Rat Pack era and its aftermath. Sinatra himself passed away on May 14, 1998, at the age of 82, succumbing to a heart attack at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. His death prompted an outpouring of tributes from around the world, celebrations of his musical legacy that largely avoided the darker aspects of his biography. The question of Andrew Celentano and of the other victims, allegedly connected to Sinatra's underworld dealings, received little attention in the eulogies and retrospectives that followed the singer's death. The men who might have answered these questions were themselves dead or imprisoned, their secrets buried with them. The files that might have documented the full extent of mob involvement in Sinatra's career remained classified or scattered across multiple agencies. The truth, such as it could be determined, existed only in fragments. A witness's vague recollection, a surveillance photograph, a coded reference in an intercepted conversation. The world remembered Frank Sinatra as a legend, a man whose voice had defined an era and whose charisma had captivated millions. The newspapers ran retrospectives of his greatest performances, his most memorable films, his contributions to American culture. Television networks broadcast tribute specials featuring celebrities sharing their fondest memories of the chairman of the board. Few mentioned his mob connections. Fewer still mentioned the men who had died in circumstances that suggested his involvement. Andrew Celentano's name appeared nowhere in the obituaries or the commemorative coverage. He had been erased from the official history, a footnote that the keepers of Sinatra's legacy preferred to ignore. 20 years after the discovery of Andrew Celentano's body, Detective Robert Halloran, long retired from the LAPD, reflected on the case that had haunted his career. He had pursued every lead, interviewed every available witness, and assembled a circumstantial case that pointed clearly toward mob involvement. But he had never been able to close the loop, to identify the specific individuals who had beaten Celentano to death and buried him in that empty lot. The case remained his greatest frustration, a reminder of the limits of justice in a world where power and wealth could shield even the most heinous crimes from accountability. The forensic examination of Andrew Celentano's remains continued through the late 1972, employing increasingly sophisticated techniques that would have been unavailable just a few years earlier. Forensic anthropologists reconstructed his injuries in precise detail, determining that he had been struck at least 8 times with a heavy cylindrical object, probably a metal pipe. The pattern of fractures suggested that the blows had been delivered by someone standing to his left, consistent with a right-handed attacker. Traces of adhesive on his wrists indicated that he had been bound with duct tape before the beating began. These details painted a picture of deliberate, methodical violence, not a crime of passion, but an execution. The identification of Celentano's remains had been relatively straightforward, thanks to the preserved wallet and the distinctive Rolex watch. His dental records, obtained from a dentist in Los Angeles, confirmed the identification. The watch bore an inscription on its back, "To Andy, 30 years of loyalty. F.S." This inscription would become one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the case, its irony not lost on investigators or journalists. 30 years of loyalty had earned Andrew Celentano a beating and a shallow grave. His service to the chairman of the board repaid with violence. Catherine Rossi, Celentano's longtime girlfriend, was located by investigators in 1977, living quietly in a small apartment in Brooklyn. She initially refused to speak with them, citing fear for her safety and a desire to leave the past behind. Eventually, after being assured of confidentiality, she provided a brief statement that shed light on Celentano's final months. She confirmed that he had been drinking heavily, that he had spoken bitterly about his treatment by Sinatra, and that he had mentioned writing a book about his experiences. She also confirmed that 2 men had visited her shortly after Celentano's disappearance, warning her to keep silent. She never saw Celentano again after May 22, 1971. The theory that Celentano had been killed to prevent him from writing a tell-all book gained support from several sources. A literary agent in New York confirmed that Celentano had approached him in early 1971, proposing a memoir about his years with Sinatra. The agent had expressed interest but had advised Celentano to wait until he had left Sinatra's employment before proceeding. Celentano had seemed impatient, eager to move forward immediately. The agent never heard from him again after May 1971 and assumed he had changed his mind about the project. The question of what Celentano might have revealed in such a book remained a subject of speculation. Based on his position and longevity in Sinatra's circle, he would have had first-hand knowledge of the singer's relationships with organized crime figures, his alleged involvement in various schemes and transactions, and the private behavior that Sinatra had worked so hard to keep hidden from the public. Such revelations could have damaged Sinatra's reputation, complicated his business dealings, and potentially exposed him to legal jeopardy. For the men who protected Sinatra's interests, eliminating this threat would have been a matter of simple calculation. The reconstruction of what probably happened to Andrew Celentano was based on forensic evidence, witness statements, and the testimony of mob informants. The most likely scenario was that Celentano had been lured to a meeting, possibly under the pretext of discussing a settlement or reconciliation, and had been ambushed by 2 or more attackers. He had been restrained, beaten to death, and transported to the burial site in the trunk of a car. The burial itself had been hasty but adequate, deep enough to avoid casual discovery, but not so deep as to require extensive excavation. The killers had expected the body to remain hidden indefinitely, and but for the construction project, they would have been right. The involvement of Jimmy Fratianno in the Celentano killing remained unproven, but widely suspected. Fratiano's later testimony about the request from Gilli Risso provided circumstantial support for this theory, though Fratiano himself claimed that he had not personally participated in the murder. He stated that he had assigned the task to a soldier in his organization named Mike Risitello, a violent man with a long history of assault and murder. Risitello, however, died in prison in 2005 without ever confirming or denying his involvement in the Celentano case. Risitello, known in mob circles as Mike Rizzi, was one of the most feared enforcers in the Los Angeles crime family during the 1972. Standing 6 feet 2 inches and weighing nearly 250 pounds, he had earned his reputation through countless acts of violence, beatings, shootings, and at least 4 murders that federal prosecutors would eventually attribute to him. His specialty was collecting debts and silencing witnesses, tasks that required a combination of physical brutality and emotional detachment that Risitello possessed in abundance. If anyone in the Los Angeles underworld had been capable of killing Andrew Celentano, it was Mike Risitello. The broader pattern of violence associated with Sinatra's orbit became clearer as more mob informants came forward in subsequent years. The 2022 book, by Mike Rothmiller and Douglas Thompson, documented numerous deaths allegedly connected to the singer, including several individuals who had been perceived as threats to his reputation or his interests. Whether Sinatra himself ordered or approved these killings remained impossible to determine, but the circumstantial evidence suggested a disturbing pattern. To know Sinatra, it seemed, could be dangerous. To betray him could be fatal. The families of the victims sought answers and closure that the criminal justice system could not provide. Andrew Celentano's mother, Maria, died in 1983, still not knowing what had happened to her son. His siblings scattered across the country, reluctant to discuss the brother whose death had brought such unwanted attention to their family. Catherine Rossi never married, never recovered from the trauma of losing her partner under such circumstances. She died in 2001, having maintained her silence about the details of her relationship with Celentano until the end. The legacy of the Celentano case extended beyond the specific facts of his murder to raise broader questions about celebrity, power, and accountability. How many other victims had there been, men and women whose deaths had been covered up or attributed to other causes? What responsibilities did the entertainment industry bear for the conditions that had allowed organized crime to flourish in its midst? And what did it say about American culture that a man as demonstrably connected to violence as Frank Sinatra could be celebrated as a national treasure while his victims mouldered in unmarked graves? Detective Halloran continued to work on the Celentano case even after his retirement, compiling evidence and interviewing witnesses on his own time. He published a memoir in 1995 that included a chapter on the investigation, detailing his frustrations and his theories about what had happened. The book received little attention outside law enforcement circles, but it preserved an important record of the case for future researchers. Halloran died in 2008, having never achieved the resolution he sought. His files were donated to a university archive, where they remain available to scholars interested in the intersection of organized crime and American celebrity. The case haunted Halloran until the end of his days. In interviews given during his final years, he spoke with evident frustration about the obstacles that had prevented him from bringing anyone to justice. The witnesses who might have talked were too afraid. The physical evidence, while compelling, was insufficient to identify specific perpetrators. The legal system, designed to protect the rights of the accused, had inadvertently provided cover for the guilty. Halloran believed he knew who had ordered Celentano's death and who had carried it out, but believing and proving were two different things in a court of law. The LAPD officially classified the Celentano case as a mob hit in 1985, a designation that acknowledged what everyone involved in the investigation already knew. The killing bore all the hallmarks of professional organized crime violence: the careful planning, the brutal execution, the disposal of the body in a location designed to prevent discovery. But classifying the case did not solve it. The killers remained at large, protected by the passage of time and the collapse of the criminal organization that had employed them. The physical evidence from the Celentano case was preserved by the Los Angeles Police Department, stored in a warehouse with thousands of other cold case files. The bones, the clothing, the wallet, the watch, all of it remained catalogued and available for future forensic examination. Should new technologies or new witnesses emerge, the possibility of solving the case definitively grew more remote with each passing year. But the evidence remained, a silent testament to a life cut short and a crime unpunished. The empty lot where Andrew Celentano's body was discovered eventually became a strip mall, as originally intended. The stores that occupy the site today include a nail salon, a dry cleaner, and a pizza parlor. Customers come and go, unaware of the history beneath their feet, unaware that a man was murdered and buried on this spot more than 50 years ago. There is no memorial, no plaque, no indication that anything significant ever happened here. Andrew Celentano has been forgotten. His story subsumed into the larger mythology of Frank Sinatra and the golden age of American entertainment. The question of what Frank Sinatra knew about the Celentano murder and when he knew it may never be definitively answered. Sinatra maintained his silence on the subject until his death, and the men who might have possessed direct knowledge have likewise passed away. The circumstantial evidence pointed toward complicity, but circumstantial evidence was not enough to build a prosecution, especially against a defendant with Sinatra's resources and connections. The truth, if it existed anywhere, existed only in the memories of those who had chosen to take it to their graves. In 2013, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office formally closed the Celentano investigation, citing the impossibility of prosecution given the deaths of key witnesses and the deterioration of physical evidence. The announcement received minimal coverage, a brief item in the local news that was quickly forgotten. The case joined the ranks of thousands of unsolved murders in Los Angeles history, another file in a warehouse, another name on a list that grew longer every year. Justice, for Andrew Celentano, would remain forever out of reach. The story of Frank Sinatra and his connections to organized crime has been told many times, in books and documentaries, in congressional hearings and journalistic investigations. The Celentano case represents just one chapter in this larger narrative, one life among many that were affected by the intersection of celebrity and criminality. But it is a chapter worth remembering, because it illustrates with particular clarity the human cost of the arrangements that made possible the golden age of American entertainment. Behind the glitter and the music, there were men like Andrew Celentano, whose loyalty was rewarded with betrayal and whose silence was ensured by violence. The final image that remains from the Celentano case is the photograph taken at the crime scene on November 14, 1976. The shallow grave, the rotted clothing, the gold watch still glinting in the afternoon light. It is an image of abandonment, of a man discarded like refuse and left to be forgotten. For 30 years, Andrew Celentano had protected Frank Sinatra, had kept his secrets, had stood between him and the dangers of the world. In the end, he received no protection himself. He received only a beating, a burial, and an anonymity that lasted 5 years until a construction worker's backhoe struck something solid in the earth. Rest in peace, Andrew Celentano. Your loyalty was repaid with violence, your service with a shallow grave. The men who killed you escaped justice, protected by the same code of silence that you honored for 3 decades. The man you served became a legend, celebrated by millions who never knew the price others paid for his success. But your story has been told now. Your name remembered. Your death acknowledged. After 50 years in darkness, you have finally been brought into the light. The chairman of the board may have sung his way to immortality, but you, his forgotten bodyguard, his discarded confidant, deserve to be remembered too. The earth of the San Fernando Valley has released you at last. May you find the peace in death that was denied you in life.